Thank you so much, Liza, for that incredible introduction, and thank you for Index for not only this 20th anniversary celebration, for all the work that you've been doing over the years to highlight purpose and innovation that actually changes and improves lives. So happy to be part of this event today. My presentation up. Okay. So what I want to speak about today is this whole idea that innovation for purpose or innovation for specific groups of people, sometimes it doesn't make market sense to innovate for a group of people that have a very limited disability or one that the market size isn't big enough. But market size isn't all there is to purposeful developments, because many times those purpose-driven innovations have impact for many of us here. And so that's what I call the virtuous circle of designing for people with different disabilities, because at the end of the day, when we design for this very specific purpose, sometimes we also then have these interesting circles back again to you and I that use those same things, right? And so here are some examples. For example, hearing aids, right? There are these incredibly expensive pieces of technology. Until very recently, many of those were kept in people's bedside drawers. Why? Because the actual interface, the thing that touches the human being, between them and the technology, there was this hard barrier. So the plastic was hard, it didn't fit good, it just wasn't the right thing. And so many times, even though the technology itself was this phenomenal piece of technology costing thousands of dollars, it was relegated to your bedside table, right? But as more and more of us started wearing in-the-ear headphones and so on and so forth, that technology improved. And that also meant that people with hearing aids could have a different kind of fitting for that hearing aid, and that led to more innovations for them. So there's this interesting cycle between, right? In fact, there's a company today that's creating a sleeve, a silicone sleeve around your headphones that can actually make a better mold so that it can interface more comfortably and you can wear your headphones for longer. So those of you who have AirPods know that, it's great until you start smiling too much or hit it or something like that and it pops out, right? If that silicone mold was a little bit better captured to the inside of your ear, it would fit better, right? And so it's a 10-cent piece of plastic, but that can make the difference between whether you wear that and you use that and adopt that technology or not. Another is things like, shoes, prosthetic shoes. Prosthetic shoes used to be, when we innovate for people with disabilities, we sometimes just think about the functional change, right? We just try to make sure that they can actually use this piece of technology. It meets that need, and that's it, right? And then after a little while, we start thinking about all the aesthetics. Oh, well, what if it looked a little bit better? What if it wasn't so ugly? What if it was actually something that all of us wanted to wear? It wasn't just for people with disabilities, it was a superpower. And that's what I think is really how we should be thinking about design, is we should be thinking about the fact that it's not just about that functional solution. It's not just about improving, eyeglasses, for example, or not just for people who can't see, because it isn't really until, I would say before Warby Parker, but there was more of this interest in making that frame a little prettier, making it, I was talking earlier about the fact that if you have something like a hearing aid, if it looked more like jewelry, more likely to wear it. Same thing with glasses now. So many of us, there's people now that don't even need glasses that want to wear glasses because they look cool, right? And so when we finally get to that place, that's when we can say that there's this real innovation that has sparked so much, not just for the people who need it, but for the rest of us. So I want us to caution against thinking that these kinds of things that we build for people with disabilities are only small markets and they'll never have a bigger impact. And I want to tell you the story specifically about VocaliD. We started in a very niche market in 2015, where we were trying to help those with severe speech disabilities. What we saw, in fact, it was here in Denmark, in Odense, where all of this started 20 years ago. I was at a conference and I was presenting my early PhD work at the time where we had found that people with very severe speech disabilities were still able to control some aspect of their voice. They could still control the pitch of their voice, the loudness of their voice, things like that, which are called prosody. And there's not that much information in prosody, but there is information about how you're saying something, and also about speaker identity. And so it's not like you're going to understand exactly what they're saying, but you can understand the intent of what they're saying. And so for someone with a very severe speech impairment, it was still the essence of their voice that was being preserved. So we were looking at this as a method of vocal control for like a joystick, a vocally controlled joystick for people with speech disorders. Right after this talk that I gave that they have this preserved capability of controlling their prosody, I walk into a kind of like an exhibit where there's people displaying different kinds of technologies, and there's users of these technologies in the room as well. And I saw a little girl and a grown man talking with different devices, but the same voice. This is 2002. And I tell this story because it was then that I thought, well, if we're saying that their voices actually relatively preserved in terms of prosody, which has speaker identity cues, why does everyone have to have the same voice? And that's 2002. And at that time, basically, if you were a child who had a speech disability, you were going to be given an adult male voice, despite the fact that you were a little girl. It didn't matter. If you're a grown woman, you were going to be given an adult male voice. Okay, that's because there were some studies that were done that showed that the adult male synthetic voice was most understood in reverberant environments such as a classroom or a workspace. Because at that time, classroom standards and workplace standards did not include different kinds of softer walls and things like that. And so the adult male voice was the one that resonated and was the most clear voice to be heard. And so that was what we were trying to change. And it really was a uniform sea of voices out there. We're now at 2020. Back in 2014, or 2007, which is when I started the research project behind VocaliD, it was really not that much change from 2002, sorry. And so we got some funding from the National Science Foundation in the US to start creating these personalized voices. But to make a synthetic voice is actually extremely difficult to do. You have to have, at least then it was, you had to have hours of speech recorded, clean speech, and from that you can actually build a computer model of the person's voice. We've come a long way in these 20 years, thank goodness. And now, because we have this belief that our voice is not identical, every single person in this voice, your voice tells a story about who you are, about where you've been, where you've lived, what your accent is. Also, perhaps, maybe that you were doing something really loud and noisy yesterday, if your voice is hoarse, and so on and so forth. So our voice tells a story about who we are, and we're not identical. And so what we've been able to do now at VocaliD, the name is actually very indicative of what we did, is taking each individual's voice and trying to create a unique personality from that voice. And the way we did that is we took a theory of speech production. So the theory of speech production is called the source filter theory of speech production. And in this theory, there are sort of two elements that make up someone's voice. So when I'm speaking today, what's being captured in the microphone is the combination of what we call the source of your voice, which is the vibrations of your vocal folds. And that really pushes, when you push sound through the vocal folds, it just creates this buzzing kind of excitation wave. It doesn't sound too much more different than many of you men in here who are maybe using an electric razor. It's that buzzing sound. So it's not really indicative of much, but there are differences between the voices that we are creating at the source, between men and women. The pitch of that voice, even the breathiness of that voice is very different depending on how you're holding your vocal folds together. And then as that air is pushed through the vocal folds and up through the vocal tract, That's the actual filter of your voice. And so the chambers of your head and your neck, your lips, your tongue, even your nasal cavity, that resonates that sound that comes from your larynx. And that resonance, or how you close your mouth or open your mouth or where you constrict, creates the different sounds that we hear. So different consonants and vowels are made up from the different closures in your mouth. So source and filter together create speech, right, that you hear. But in the digital world, you can decompose these. So what you can do is separate the source and separate the filter. It's by a technique called inverse filtering. And what's really interesting here is then you can also recombine it, right? It's just when you separate voices, you can then recombine them again. So imagine you have a brown egg and you have a white egg. And I only want the source from one and only the filter from another. Because the filter of the person who cannot speak is impaired. So there's no reason that we want to have them record. We don't want them to speak in an impaired way. We want to understand what they're saying. But their source is what's unique about them, what's identifying about them. So we just want to capture the source characteristics from the person who is unable to speak, but can still make sound, okay? And then we want to find someone who's similar to them in age and gender, accent, all of these things, even height, because height changes how your voice sounds. So if you give someone who's super tiny a very deep voice, it'll sound very weird. And if you give someone very tall a really puny voice, it will also sound very weird. And so we have to combine the right eggs together, let's say, right? And so we only want the filter characteristics from the white egg. And then we want to put them together. And that's exactly what the innovation was behind VocaliD. And so what we had the opportunity to do was essentially create a way to get people around the world to donate their voice. So to contribute their voice to what we call the Human Voice Bank Initiative. And the Human Voice Bank Initiative was a way for us to gather the voices of people of different age, of different accents, and so on and so forth, so that we could create these unique synthetic voices for those who needed them. And the first opportunity I had to talk about this was at TED Women in 2013, which is actually what sparked the beginning of the company, because prior to that, this was just research in my lab. There was maybe a half a dozen people that we'd made these voices for. Really, it was a conceptual idea and a theoretical idea, which we had proven out a few times, not more than a handful of times. But what happened in this talk is at the end of the talk, I said, well, what if you could donate your voice to someone in need? And honestly, we thought maybe a couple hundred people would say yes, right? We actually had this free MailChimp account or set up basically where you could sign up to donate your voice. And it was the cheap one, right? So you could only get 200 or 2,000 or something like that people. We figured who's going to sign up to record 7 to 10 hours of speech? And incredibly, within the first month, we had over 2,000 people. Then we had 10,000 people the next month. And I was just like, wow, this could be real. I mean, even if 10% of these people aren't lying, and that they really want to donate their voice, right? This could be a something. And that's what started the company. I was not an entrepreneur. I was a professor. I had the ability I knew how to write a grant, and so I wrote a grant to the National Science Foundation. We got this commercialization grant, and that's how VocaliD was started. And it was actually really, I was talking to Liza over lunch today saying it was so challenging to get the early funding for VocaliD because back then in 2015, nobody really knew about the echo. Nobody really, it had just started, I guess. 2014 is when the Echo came out and the Google Home came out. But people weren't thinking, who else could benefit from this? What else could these voices be used for? Is it just for people with special needs? Well, how many of them are there? What's that market size? It looks so small. You're just a researcher. What are you doing? Is this just a science project? Those were some of the questions that were being asked. And it wasn't until later where you start to see, well, maybe there are other purposes as well. And even if you say it, you can't get there. So let me just show you an example. Let me just back up a second. I'm going to play you a sample of sort of what we did with the decoupling of the voices. So let me set this up a little bit more. This young girl, her name is Maeve. She was one of our first recipients of what we call a bespoke voice. A bespoke voice is a voice that is created with the source and filter from two different people. Okay, so that sound that she just made We had her produce various different sounds, and really that's about all she can do with her vocal capacity. So she makes sounds all the time when she's trying to get people's attention and all of this, but they're not clear. There are sounds like this. So this was her trying to sustain a vowel, the vowel ah. Okay, but in that vowel production, there is information about who she is and what her voice is. This young girl, Maeve, was using the exact same synthetic voice, an adult female voice, as many of the other kids in her school that also have special needs. And it was her young sister, who was around 9 years old, who had written me this note or an email after the TED Talk and said, I want to donate my voice. I heard about this. My sister's voice sounds like an adult female, and I would love for her to have a voice that fits more with our family, which was very, very touching. And it was something that I just kind of thought, wow, a 9-year-old has this, this understanding of what the importance is of voice. It was really moving. So what happened is we took her voice, inverse filtered it, and then in this case we did use a sibling. We typically do not use siblings because it causes more sibling rivalry than is necessary. And so then we find a sibling, and
ice cream is my guilty pleasure.
It was Erin, who recorded not just this one sentence. She had to record about 3,000 sentences. That's what we needed at that time. This is back in 2015 is when this voice was built. So we inverse filtered them, recombined them. Once we recombine them, we have 3,000 sentences that only have Erin's filter characteristics, but Maeve's source characteristics, okay? So those 3,000 sentences are now fed to a computational engine that tries to learn the speaking patterns of this adapted voice and then tries to create this adapted voice saying a few different sentences. It's basically an engine. It's a text-to-speech engine. You can now type in anything, not those 3,000 sentences that Erin said, but anything. Just type in whatever you want, and it will reproduce it to sound like the combination of these two.
I can't wait for my friends to hear my new voice. My parents are really happy I'm not addicted to Fortnite. I want to meet Taylor Swift.
These are some of the earliest things that Maeve said. This is a voice made in 2015, so it's still got a little bit of tinniness to it and so on and so forth. But I wanted to play this to you to see, sometimes we get stuck in, well, it's not perfect, right? What it meant for Maeve, though, is that she ended up having more, ended up using her device more. Just like those hearing aids, when you have an assistive communication device, typically people try to guess what you want to say. Guess what you want to do based on your routines and things like that. They don't get agency in the same way. Maeve was able to want to use her voice and wanted to use her voice and differentiated from others. And so she had that power of communication. She's now, I think, 15 or 16 years old. And there's just like this life to her that's very different because she has this feeling of that speaking box is not just a speaking box. It's part of her identity. It's an extension of who she is. And this is now the third generation since that voice where we can actually give her updates to the voice as the voice changes. When she gets a little older, she'll most likely want a completely new voice. We can start to age the voice a little bit over time, but once you kind of pass a certain level in terms of what the voice needs to sound like, because that sounds like a little girl, right? Once you kind of go through, we have sort of these 4 age bands. You have a child voice, you have a teen voice, then you have an adult voice, and then a mature voice. So within the age band, you can kind of age the voice. But as you go across the age band, you have to do the process again. So we'll likely do the process again. She can pick whoever she wants as their voice donor, and she can go from there. Okay, so the next thing I want to tell you about is, bespoke voices are really where we started. And, up until then, we hadn't really thought about other use cases for these voices. But what we found is that many people who were losing their voice to conditions like Liza mentioned earlier with motor neuron disease or even with things like head and neck cancer, where you have 2 weeks before from the time that you are told that you have a severe condition, where they're going to either remove part of your tongue, part of your larynx, or something like that, to spare you, to make sure that you could get that cancer, but that leaves you voiceless or speechless for the rest of your life. There are other methodologies for these individuals where they might hold an electrolarynx up to their throat or other kinds of devices. But people sometimes still want to sound like themselves, and an electrolarynx doesn't necessarily sound like themselves. And so if you bank your voice ahead of time, we can recreate your voice without having to mix the voice with somebody else. You can just have your own recordings be the base to make the voice. Initially, I felt like this isn't innovative enough. It's just recording the person's voice, and so it's not really making use of all our technology. I quickly learned it didn't matter what I thought. What mattered is that this could help somebody who needs this, and it is still their voice. So sometimes you have to take yourself out of the equation. I think as scientists, you're constantly going, well, it needs to be innovative. It's not only about the innovation, it's also about the use and what factor of their life is going to change as a result of this. So I want to play you next a movie of a gentleman who was diagnosed with tongue cancer, and he also had laryngeal cancer. So he was going to have both his tongue and his voice box removed. And he's going to tell you and he had 2 weeks between the time of surgery and the time that he learned about VocaliD.
I have a turtle and a dog and 2 goldfish. The speech therapist let me know that I should be able to bank my voice for future reference. Real isn't how you are made. Eyelashes and cheeks and lips were so coated. When I'm going to speak to someone, instead of them hearing, well, here comes computer lawn again, they're gonna be actually kind of like hearing what I used to sound like, which is, I think, great technology.
Okay, and so he did, it says 4,000 lines, it was actually 3,000 lines. I don't know why they do that. but anyways, so here is Lonnie's, original sentence.
You wish to know all about my grandfather? Well, he's nearly 93 years old.
Okay, so same process, but no mixing.
My family threw a surprise birthday party for me. There was close to 100 friends and family. Most had not seen me since my surgery, but thanks to your technology, they heard me instantly recognizing my voice.
So what's really interesting about this gentleman is that although he ended up passing 2 years after we were able to build this voice for him, his family, he used this voice all the time, whenever he possibly could after his surgery. And it was really great to see how much of an advocate he was for banking one's voice, because in those 2 weeks, he spent a good amount of time doing this, which meant that, he also did some recordings for his family of his own voice and so on. But he kind of became this advocate for us and started telling people about it and so on, because it was really only a few hospitals that even knew about what we were doing. But after he passed, his family continued to want to use the voice to hear him as part of the grieving process. And there was one grandchild that was born after he passed away. And I think one of the things that was it sort of gives me goosebumps even to talk about it, is that they played samples that one of the grandkids, the older grandkids, wanted the younger one to hear what Grandpa sounded like. And so they would read stories, little kid stories, like the caterpillar story and stuff like that, in the Grandpa's voice for the younger one. I just thought that was so important, like the importance of being able to have that legacy of someone's voice continue on. So that's actually some of the work that we were doing at VocaliD. We continue to do this work, and now we're really focused on head and neck cancer and progressive diseases, because there is this finite timeline in terms of when someone needs this technology, and we find that it's one where we need to act quickly in order to preserve those voices. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit to back to the idea here about design, is around late 2019, 2018, 2019, was we started to see that there was this perfect storm happening in the rest of the industry in terms of many technologies out there, excuse me, that were voice first. So a number of new platforms that were out there, like the Amazon Alexa, as well as Google Home and so on, where more and more things were starting to speak to us. We call this the voice first revolution, right? In addition, machine learning had taken off to a point where that we were able to make voices with very limited amount of speech rather than having to have 2,000 or 3,000 sentences. And those voices were starting to have emotion and more characteristics about their voice rather than just what we were able to do in the early phases. And the last piece of the perfect storm is the open voice movement. So as more and more of the tools, the software tools, were open sourced, not open voice, open source, that meant that we were able to accelerate innovation quicker. And so the combination of all of these things together meant that there were more companies out there doing not just customized voices, but creating technologies that could benefit more people, as well as industry. And so this together gave us, I think, the first sort of indication that there will be other applications for our work. What I want to show in this graph is the speed of adoption of certain platforms. And when we think about software, we also have to first think about the hardware that the software is going to run on. So when we think about computers and the internet, it took about 20 years for that technology to be widely adopted. And until that was widely adopted, many people didn't have access to it, right? The TV was adopted faster in about 10 years. The smartphone, we used to think, was the fastest adopted piece of technology, and it really wasn't. It took about 7 years. It is very fast, but it wasn't until we had smart speakers that we saw what real rapid adoption is. So nowadays, though, we also have the combination of smart speakers and smartphones on which we can run voice-first applications. But what I'm bringing to light here is the fact that you had to have that hardware platform and then the capability of all of these creative minds who are creating software on those platforms that can allow us to use this technology to its fullest potential. So that is what is the sort of the first inkling. Now, between 2019 and now, we have so many more applications that speak to us. And more, we are seeing everything from advertising to new forms of telecommunication that is being created by synthetic voice. And so what I want to play you next is
Special advertised offers reflect specific vehicle stock numbers listed in the supporting information for each offer and are available for well-qualified consumers with approved credit. Special offers may require financing or leasing through a particular...
Okay. Gosh, he scared me. So that was that a synthetic voice or a human voice? Human? We're half and half-ish. So it's a human first, but that created a synthetic voice. So it's a synthetic voice that you just heard, reading a disclaimer. It's super fast. If you actually tried to just make a synthetic voice on a regular talking human and then you just tried to speed it up, it would sound crappy. But what this is a person who does disclaimers for life. And so then we created a synthetic voice with his disclaimer voice. And this disclaimer voice is being used on various other disclaimers now. And so what's really interesting is that's sort of a mundane use case, but it's one where there is now the replicability of his voice for lots of other things, right? So we're seeing a number of different applications. And this is where VocaliD's technology is not just for people with disabilities, it has expanded its use cases. So the next few samples I'm going to play you, and they won't come as much of a surprise to me, are in advertising. So this one here.
Combining its fun and responsive city driving capabilities with hybrid power, the new Toyota Yaris Hybrid truly is full of positive energy. When you have the energy to keep going, why stop?
That's a synthetic voice. It's hard to imagine how far it's come in this little amount of time. There's still some inflection that could be delivered and so on, but if you didn't know that, you wouldn't, if you weren't listening for is it synthetic or a human, you wouldn't know. And many of the advertisements we hear today on streaming especially are all synthetically generated. And so there's this whole thing now about like, oh, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Because what happens to voice actors and so on, and we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to play you 2 more samples.
They aren't just barrels. It isn't just highway work. It's a community investment. In a world that can be in such a rush, here's a place to keep it slow and steady. Every driver makes a difference, so stay alert. Eliminate distractions and mind your speed. Good choices behind the wheel keeps us all safe. This message sponsored by the Wisconsin Department of Transport.
So some of the reasons for this is why synthetic? Well, because you can get the messages out faster than you can with humans. You might be able to do it more economically. There could be different accents. The same message could be said in different languages and so on and so forth. So there's a benefit. It's not just to take the human out of the loop, but it's also for things that are really time sensitive, right? And this last one I'm going to play you is, I've got 2 samples. These are new things that we're doing with Veritone. So VocaliD was recently acquired in June of 2022 by a company called Veritone, and Veritone is an enterprise AI solution. And so it does a number of different things using AI. One vertical is in voice. And so there's 2 different projects that we're doing. The first one is actually for entertainment. It's a completely new media content where we're going to be creating media content for Cameo. And Cameo, as you probably all know, when you can give someone a Cameo, this is Cameo for kids, where you can send them a message. And so with different character voices.
Merry Christmas, Olivia! It's me, your buddy, Cody. Isn't this just the best time of year? I hope you have a dino-tastic Christmas. Someone special told me that you already...
So you can hear that that's the voice of a character. I don't exactly know what the cartoon is. I should probably. But it is a specialized message created for that individual. It's a customized message. And the last one, I think, which is interesting, especially in today's day, is we're doing live sports play-by-play. So for live sports, what we're doing is taking play-by-plays of games that wouldn't necessarily be commentated in a certain audience, for a certain audience, and you would get live commentary. So I'll play you this.
Long kick down the field. Estrada gets the ball. Back to Pelé, back to Estrada. He shoots. Goal!
Sorry about that. But what's interesting there is that you have only the elements. You don't have any of the content. All you have is who's passed the ball to whom. So just the metadata, and from that we're generating both play-by-play and then also the voice from it, okay? So you can imagine that there's going to be new media content that's created with this technology. So from 2015 to now, it's just radically changed. What we were hearing initially was just the voice creation. Now we're combining not just synthetic voice creation, but also language technologies with voice technologies and creating these whole conversational experiences. So what are the opportunities here? Some of the opportunities here are really in terms of democratizing who we hear. Up until now, there was only sort of a select group of voices that we would hear in our content and our media. And by having capabilities like this, we can have broader audiences, because sometimes the cost was prohibitive to make voices that were differently accented in different languages and so on and so forth. So there is this larger democratization. There's also the capability of turning content from in one language into languages we don't typically have the resources for. You could do that more efficiently using AI. New creative media, like I talked about, and new markets and audiences as well. So what we know is that much of the content that we have in some of the Germanic languages and in English is only consumed by a small population, but there's the rest of the world that doesn't have access to that content. And if we can make that content accessible in different languages, we have more of the world can access this information, which is, I think, really, really important. Some of the challenges are, though, that, again, there are industries of people that do some of these recordings, and that's talent, and figuring out good talent rights, fair use rights, and so on is actually super important. The other is that, everyone's worried about synthetic media, right? In terms of synthetic video, synthetic voices, and so on and so forth. being used or being misused. So the unintended consequences are just as important as the intended consequences that we create with our technologies. And so we have to make sure that the new media that we create doesn't fool or convince people to do things that we didn't want the technology to be used in other ways. And so making sure that the ethics and the transparency of the technology use is also preserved. The last few things is that I think there's going to be some regulation in this space, because up until now, we have kind of had all this technology come about, but no ways to really control what that technology can be used for and how it can be used. So a lot of really exciting things coming up, but also some challenges that we have to work through as a community and as a society about what we want to do with new capabilities like this. I want to end actually with my talk going back again to the circle of how important voice is and how important it is to think about the preservation of voice, but also value our voice. So many of us feel like, oh, I don't like my voice. I would never want my voice to be recreated. I don't like the way it sounds on the answering machine, if we don't have answering machines anymore, but a voice message or whatever. And yet it's not until you lose it that you value what it meant, because it is a piece of you and your identity. So these last few quotes are from people who are either family members or individuals who we were able to help with their synthetic voice, their VocaliD. And the meaning of it, not just for them, but their extended family and their communities, I think is something that I feel like that's the biggest thing I cherish about what we started and where we came from that initial germ of that idea way back when. So with that, I want to end just to say thank you so much. And if anyone's interested in contributing their voice, we are always looking for more voices. And so please contribute today. We've got about 95,000 people from around the world who have contributed their voice to the Human Voice Bank Initiative. People from 6 all the way to 91 years of age, and millions of sentences banked. So this will help us create more voices for people who need them. Thank you.